Genesis 37. We started talking about the story of Joseph this morning, and we want to sum up some of those things and deal with what we learned from the story of Joseph and compare it with Jesus. Joseph is Jacob's favorite son. Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph is the one who is his father's favorite, who's going to receive all of the benefits and blessings of the firstborn. Because of this, he's hated by his other brothers, right? They're jealous of him. Their hatred for him continues as they hear about the dreams that he has, and as he comes back and tattles on them about some of the things that they have been doing with the flock. And ultimately, they sell him into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. While he's in Egypt, in spite of the difficulties, in spite of being thrown into prison while in the land of Egypt, he remains faithful to God, and ultimately God puts Joseph as second in command of all of the land of Egypt, in a position to save all of the world. In spite of the terrible circumstances that he's been through, God put him in a position to save all of the world. His brothers and the dreams that he has had about them are fulfilled as his brothers come looking for bread from Joseph himself, and they must bow down before Joseph and ask for bread from him. Ultimately, through a series of events that we talked about this morning, he reveals himself to his brothers and shows that he is indeed Joseph after he sees that they have changed, and he forgives them. And remember what we talked about as we close from Genesis chapter 45. Several times in Genesis 45, Joseph emphasizes the fact that it was not his brothers who sent him into captivity, but it was God who orchestrated all of these things and worked them out so that he would be in a position to save the world. Particularly, if you read with me Genesis 45, verses 5 through 9. Genesis 45, verses 5 through 9. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. And He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all of his household, ruler over all of the land of Egypt. Hurry, go tell my father, and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all of Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. God has fulfilled His promises. But what's the point in going over the story of Joseph? We sang before class this morning the song, More About Jesus, Tell Me. What's the point about going over the story of Joseph? Well, most of the time in the Bible, God tells stories in such a way to call you back to previous stories. We do the same thing today. We tell a story in a certain way with certain details that otherwise would be insignificant, but they call to mind stories from the past. Let's go back through a couple of the details of the story of Joseph and see if we can't pick this out, particularly as we think about Jesus. First of all, in Genesis 37, and I recognize that I'm assuming a little knowledge in what we're going over this afternoon because we have been over it this afternoon. So if you're a little fuzzy on the story of Joseph, go back and read Genesis 37 through 50 this afternoon and check up on some of these things. But if you look in Genesis 37, because Joseph is in the position that he's in Genesis 37 in verse 4, his brothers absolutely hate him and they can't speak peacefully to him. And it's not going to get any better. Joseph has some dreams, and he begins telling them about these dreams. And in verse 5, their hatred for him grows. And in verse 8, their hatred for him grows. Finally, after they tell the last dream, 2 of his dreams that he's had, it says in verse 11 that his brothers are just jealous of him. His brothers hate him. They're jealous of him because of all of the dreams that he's having and because of the attention that he's getting from his fathers. What else would you do under this circumstance but take care of him, right? Get him out of the way. And they have an opportunity in chapter 37, verses 18 through 20. As Joseph comes searching for them at Shechem and then at Dothan, he finds them and they see him a long way off, and they make plans to be able to kill him, even though Joseph is still a long while off. But instead of killing him, all of the plots that they have against him, they're restrained because of the conscience of one of the 12 brothers, Reuben, who speaks up for Joseph, and because of that, they just throw him into a pit. But not wanting to get nothing out of Joseph, they don't want to take him home. After everything that they've done with him, he can't go home now, right? And so they want to get something out of him, unless, of course, if they kill him, of course, they're not going to. And so Judah, one of the 12 brothers again, decides, well, let's just sell him. We don't know what's going to happen to him, but we assume that he will die. And they sell him for a measly price, just 20 shekels of silver in Genesis 37 and verse 28. Some of the brothers, Reuben in particular, some of the 12 are horrified by what has been done, but there's nothing to do. There's nothing that they can do to change the situation, right? Joseph has been sold. The situation is done. Joseph is gone, probably to be killed. What else can be done? Joseph goes to Egypt, a long way from home. In spite of the fact that he does what is right, he's convicted of a crime. A man who has done nothing wrong, and yet he's convicted of a crime, and he's thrown into prison for it, even though he hasn't done anything wrong. Finally, after he spent some years languishing in prison, he's able to come to the aid of Pharaoh, who's had 2 dreams, and to interpret those dreams. And at the age of 30 years old, in Genesis 41 and verse 46, Joseph is put in the position to save all of the world. And in particular, there's a famine in the land. People need food. People need bread. And he gives them the bread which results in life, right? He provides not only for them, but for any who would come to the land of Egypt and ask. He gives bread even to those who deserve judgment. He even provides for the people who have mistreated him, for the people who have sold him into slavery, for the people who wanted to kill him, for his own brothers who deserve judgment. He provides food and sustenance and salvation for them. And amazingly enough, as we talked about this morning, all of the evil that was done by his brothers, and all of the intent of their heart bent on evil, actually accomplishes not destruction and death, but salvation, not just for Joseph, right, but for all of the world. These men who had no higher goal than to simply get rid of get rid of Joseph. We're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Get rid of Joseph, kill him, get him out of the way. No higher goal than that results in salvation for all of the world. It's amazing, though. It's amazing under those conditions, the forgiveness of Joseph, isn't it? After all of these years, we talked about this morning, at least 22 years since Joseph has seen his brothers, since he has been sold into slavery. Now he sits as second man most powerful in the world. Everyone who wants to do anything must come through him. If you want to live, you're going to have to come to him and eat. And here stand his brothers who have mistreated him. What's he going to do? He forgives them. And not only that, but in Genesis 45, and I know we cut off here this morning, but in Genesis 45 through the rest of the book, he provides a place for them to live. And they're not just living somewhere in some distant land so he never has to see them again, right? They're living with him. They're living with him in the land of Egypt. He's provided for them. He's forgiven them. And that forgiveness once given is eternal. Because his brothers are worried about that. What if Joseph isn't just dealing with us right now because our father's alive, right? He doesn't want to stir things up while our dad's alive, but their father died in Genesis 49. Now it's all over. The hoax is over, right? He can lay down the hammer. And so they come to Joseph in Genesis 50 and they say, look, while our dad was still alive, he asked us to talk with you and said, please forgive the sons for everything that they've done. And Joseph's response to that in Genesis 50 is to get upset and to be grieved, because he had already forgiven them. And he already recognized that everything that was happening was a result of what God was accomplishing. So again, as we close this concept, turn over to Genesis 50 and let's read verses 19 through 21. And let's see that the forgiveness of Joseph is not something that's going to stop. Once given, it is in place and eternal, and nothing is ever going to change. And he wants his brothers, after he has forgiven them, he wants to be able to provide for them and he wants to live with them. And he doesn't want that to change. He doesn't want them to be afraid. Genesis 50 and verse 19. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. What an awesome story. A brother who is betrayed by his other brothers, who's left for dead, who they all think is dead, but they get back alive again. And in the circumstance that they thought would have killed him, God actually brings salvation for all of the world. Have you ever heard a story like that before? Well, I hope so. When you think about some of the elements in the story of Joseph, when Jesus comes and we begin reading his story, you recognize that the story of Jesus is told in a very similar way, right? There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, but those who were his own did not receive him. John 1, verses 9 to 11. You remember later on in the Gospel of John, the other brothers of Mary, accommodatively, we will call them brothers of Jesus, but the other sons of Mary, are gathered around Jesus at the first part of John chapter 7. And the Feast of Booths is getting ready to come up. And his brothers say to Jesus in John chapter 7 and verse 3, leave here and go into Judea so that your disciples may see your works which you're doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Then it explains why they said that in verse 5, right? For not even his brothers were believing in him. Jesus came to his own, but his own did not accept him. His own brothers did not believe in him in John chapter 7 and verse 5. His brothers, his countrymen, hated him. You think about later on in John chapter 7. We're skipping a lot of dialogue between Jesus and the crowd at the Feast of Booths. But some of the officers and Pharisees send people into the crowd to arrest Jesus. They're sick of hearing him teach. They send them into the crowd to arrest Jesus. Some of the officers who had been sent to arrest Jesus come back, and the Pharisees and religious leaders say, why didn't you bring him here? Why didn't you get him? Why didn't you arrest him? And they say, well, nobody's ever spoken to us the way this man speaks. And the Pharisees and the religious leaders say, maybe we need to listen harder now. They say, don't tell me you've been led astray too. All of the dumb people, all of the common people who don't know the law, they have believed in Him, yes. But who among the learned people who know the law, who of them have believed in Him? Throughout the gospel accounts, you see over and over again the fact that the religious leaders, Jesus' own people, hated Him. You remember as Jesus stands trial before Pilate, in Mark's account in particular, you think back to what Shane read for us earlier this morning from Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 becomes very important with Mark's account of the crucifixion, particularly the fact that Jesus did not open His mouth. If you have a red letter Bible, you'll recognize that the last part of Mark 14 and Mark 15, Jesus doesn't hardly speak. Pilate asked Him a question while He's there, and Jesus said, "You said it." That's not an answer. That's all Jesus said. All the while, the chief priests and religious leaders are standing by Jesus, yelling and screaming and accusing Him harshly in Mark 15 and verse 3. Finally, Pilate sees everything that's going on, and he recognizes in Mark 15 and verse 10 that they've handed Jesus over because they hate Him, because they're jealous of Him, because they're envious of Him. It's not because there's any real charge here. They're upset with Jesus, not because of something that Jesus has done wrong, but because they're envious and jealous of Him. And constantly, even at a distance, the religious leaders are plotting against Jesus. In John chapter 11, Jesus does a terrible thing. Jesus raises someone from the dead. Isn't that awful? And some of the people go and tell the religious leaders and chief priests, "You'll never believe what Jesus is doing now, raising people from the dead." And so the Jews and chief priests decide, well, the only thing that we can do with Jesus is kill Him. And so they tell the rest of the people in John chapter 11, if Jesus comes to the feast, you let us know. We're going to take care of Him. You remember in other passages, like at the beginning of Matthew 26 or in Mark chapter 14, as Passover is coming, again, they're plotting to try and kill Jesus. They know He's probably coming. They haven't seen Him, but from a distance, they're getting ready to take care of Him as He approaches. But one of Jesus' own, one of the 12, does that sound familiar? Betrays Jesus. Just as Joseph was one of 12 brothers, Jesus has 12 disciples, and one of those 12 betrayed Jesus to the chief priests and the Pharisees. Remember, after Joseph's brothers decide that they're going to get rid of him and get a little money out of him, they sell him in the hands of foreigners, right? Into the hands of foreigners to get rid of him. The Jews, when they want to get rid of Jesus, put Him into the hands of foreigners, Pilate and the Romans, in order to kill Jesus. Jesus is betrayed by one of the 12 for a measly 30 shekels of silver, just like Joseph had been sold for 20 shekels of silver. You remember, after Joseph was gone, had been sold, one of the 12 comes back and is horrified by everything that's going on. One of the 12, it happens to be the very one who sold Jesus into the hand of the chief priests and religious leaders, recognized that something about this situation in Matthew 27 is different. Jesus has been mobbed before, Luke 4, John 8, among other examples. And Jesus got out unscathed. What makes this situation different? If Jesus is going to get out anyway, might as well make a little money. But as Judas sees that this time Jesus is not getting out, he's horrified by what has gone on, and he cannot live with himself. Jesus is taken before the council, and even though they know that he has done nothing wrong, they trump up liars to come and bring charges against Jesus. And Jesus is convicted of a crime that he did not commit. Of course, you'll remember that Jesus is about the age of 30 in Luke chapter 3 and verse 23 when He was in a position to save the world. Jesus, throughout His ministry, be turning over to John chapter 6. Jesus, throughout His ministry, proclaims that He has been sent by God to provide sustenance and salvation to the people. Remember, Joseph provided bread and life for the people in the land of Egypt, any who wanted it. Jesus promises the same, bread of life, to any who will believe in Him. In John chapter 6, you'll remember that Jesus has fed at least 5,000 men, probably more women and children, and still has some left over. Because of this, the people want to make Jesus king. But Jesus tells them, don't work for the food which perishes. You're just following me because you ate something. Work for the food which endures to eternal life. The people say, well, Moses gave us manna out of the wilderness. What do you give as a sign that God is with you? Jesus says this. We'll do a little bit of reading in John 6, beginning in verse 32. Jesus says this, John chapter 6 and verse 32. Jesus said, truly, truly, I say to you, it's not Moses who has given you the bread out of heaven. It is my Father who gives you the true bread out of heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world. They said, Lord, always give us this bread. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger. He who believes in me will never thirst. We'll skip down to verse 47. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread which comes down out of heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down out of heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread also which I give for the life of the world is my flesh. The people have said, Moses gave us bread out of heaven. Jesus said that bread didn't last. The people who wandered around the wilderness all died. They ate the bread, but they died. It didn't do them any good. Nobody from Joseph's day is around. Yes, he provided bread for them, but it didn't last long. They're all dead. They all died anyway. But I give you bread that one may eat of it and never die. We could continue reading verses 53 through 58, but let's just use the last words of Jesus in verse 58. All of this, as Jesus taught in the synagogue at Capernaum, Jesus says, he who eats this bread will live forever. Around Passover time in the synagogue, you would read passages like Exodus 16 and 17, Numbers chapter 11, and you would remember all of the bread that God has provided for the people in the past, and all of the food that God has provided for the people in the wilderness in the past. Jesus says, I am the true bread. You think Joseph provided a lot of bread, you think Moses provided a lot of bread and sustenance for the people. I provide the true bread, salvation, for any who will come. You know what's amazing though? Jesus provides that salvation to people who don't deserve it. To the people who rejected Him. To the people who mistreated Him. To the people who put Him on the cross. You know, later on, as the early disciples begin to teach in passages like Acts 2 and following, they're standing before the same people who would have killed Jesus. And the message is not that, I'm sorry, you know, Jesus, the King of the earth, came and He gave you an opportunity and you rejected that. You didn't bow down. You didn't submit to Him. You killed Him. You did all of this. You lost your chance. That's not the message in Acts 2 and following, is it? The message is that in spite of what you have done, in spite of what you deserve, and they don't shy away from the fact that you're the one who handed Jesus over. One thing that's fascinating as you read the Gospels, you know the Passover where Jesus is killed in Acts 2, 50 days apart, and every Jewish male that was there the first time would have to be there the second time. If you participated in Jesus' death, you're here today in Acts chapter 2, and you've still got a chance. The door is not closed. Jesus offers sustenance and salvation to all, even to those who don't deserve it. Like we mentioned this morning, reading from Acts chapter 2, the evil of man and all of their plotting actually accomplished hope and salvation for all. Pilate, the Romans, the chief priests and religious leaders, and the Jews who condemned Jesus to death were not doing so out of a deep-seated plan to save the world, but simply with the single goal to silence Jesus, shut this troublemaker up. And yet ultimately it resulted in salvation for all of the people. Look in Acts chapter 4. Let's read a few verses over here. Acts chapter 3, Peter and John have gone to the temple at the 9th hour to pray. They meet a lame man. They heal him. They take the opportunity and all the excitement that gathers around in Acts chapter 3 to preach Jesus to them. Because of this, the Sadducees in particular, and the religious leaders are upset because they're preaching that Jesus is the resurrection. They don't believe in the resurrection, shouldn't talk about things like this, and so they arrest Peter and John, and they want to silence them. Peter and John stand before the same court that convicted Jesus just a couple of days before. Earlier on, of course, they had been on the outside of the courtyard in John's account of the Gospels, but now they get a chance to be on the inside. Things have changed a little bit. And they proclaim that Jesus is indeed the only one who can provide salvation. And there is no other name under heaven through which men may be saved. Because of this, the religious leaders recognize that a miracle has been done, and if they do anything too rash, they're not going to get away with it. Because this lame man who we've all seen for years is now walking and leaping and praising God, so you can't silence that. But we're going to warn these guys and tell them that unless they stop preaching about Jesus, terrible things are going to happen. Their response to this is to go pray to God. Gather all of the Christians together in verse 23 and pray to God. And when they do, they quote from particularly Psalm chapter 2. Which talks about the fact that the Gentiles rage. You look in verse 25. The Gentiles rage, the peoples devise futile things, the kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers gathered together against the Lord and against His Messiah. Psalm 2 envisions a time when all of the nations try and throw off God's authority, right? And they're sick of God's authority. They're going to test it. They're going to go to war against it. And they're making all of these plans and plotting to do away with God and His authority and His plan. And God all the time is sitting in heaven just laughing at their attempts to do anything against Him. But notice verses 27 and 28. It's not just that they can't do anything against God. They can't do anything that doesn't go hand in hand with what God wants. Verse 27, truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. When they look back on the events of everything that happened in order to kill Jesus, of course the religious leaders and the Romans are doing what they think will silence the people and stop this rebellion and shut up Jesus once and for all. And yet they ultimately accomplish God's purpose to save the world. Turn over to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, it's the last week of Jesus' life. Jesus has been going around in the temple teaching. After this particular parable that He's going to tell, He's going to be challenged by several different groups who are going to try and shut Him up unsuccessfully. But in Mark chapter 12, Jesus tells a parable. See if this sounds familiar. Beginning in verse 1, Mark 12 and verse 1, it says He began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a vat under the winepress and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. They took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent them another slave. They wounded him on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent them another, and that one they killed. And so with many others, beating some and killing others. He had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those vine growers said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." They took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers and will give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read this scripture? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. They were seeking to seize him, but they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke the parable against them. So they left and went away. You have someone renting out a vineyard. He sends people to get some of the produce of the vineyard. They mistreat all of them or kill them. Finally, he sends his son, thinking things will be different, right? A father sends his son, thinking surely things will be different. Everyone will respect my son, knowing who he is. Whether we're talking about brothers here, or kinsmen, or neighbors, or whatever the situation, everybody's going to know this is my son, and they're going to treat him appropriately. The father sends his son to check on things, and yet they see that son coming from a distance, and they begin to make plans. They mistreat the son, and they ultimately kill him. And they throw him out just as they throw Joseph out into a pit after they've mistreated him and stripped him of his garments. And of course, ultimately, what Jesus is talking about is understood by everybody there in verse 12. The chief priests and the religious leaders know Jesus is talking about what they're trying to do to himself. And yet the story itself calls us back to the story of Joseph. Just as Joseph was mistreated in the past, so Jesus will be by his own people, by his own brothers, and yet it will result in salvation. But the best part about the story of Joseph is also the exciting part about the story of Jesus, isn't it? We have rejected Jesus. We have mistreated Jesus. He came to earth to help us, to save us. We rejected the message. If we had been there, we would have been part of the crowd screaming for his crucifixion. Whether you were someone close to Jesus like the disciples who rejected him and forsook him, whether you were someone who was completely opposed to him like the religious leaders, Jesus offered a chance for all. But notice John chapter 14. Jesus offers forgiveness for everybody, and he wants to make sure that everyone who he forgives, who has betrayed him, will be able to live with him. Let's start back in chapter 13 of John in verse 36. Jesus has just said he's going away and they will not be able to follow. In verse 36, Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus said, "Where I go you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. Even one of the people who is sitting here hearing these words recognizes that in a matter of moments he's getting ready to betray Jesus. He doesn't deserve to be with Jesus anymore. And yet Jesus doesn't stop there. He keeps on going. "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I am going." Thomas said to him, "We do not know where you are going. How do we know the way?" Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. If you have known me, you have known my Father also. From now on, you know Him and have seen Him. Jesus' message here to these disciples who in a matter of moments are getting ready to betray Him is, there's still hope. I'm going to prepare a place for you. Just like Joseph sent his brothers back to his father and said, bring them back to Egypt. I'm preparing a place for you all to live with me. Jesus has provided the means of forgiveness and salvation so that we're not getting what we deserve, but not only that, we get to live with Him forever. Not separated from His presence, but enjoying His presence for all of eternity. Have you come to Jesus? Have you received the forgiveness that Jesus alone has offered? I didn't ask whether you've rejected Jesus. I know everyone here has done that. We're all in the same boat. We've all fallen short of what God expects. We've all gone in the opposite direction. But Jesus, as a good brother, didn't give up on us. God used the mistreatment that Jesus received to bring about salvation for the world. Have you come to Jesus? Have you been cleansed of your sins in baptism? Have you fallen away? Have you fallen short in your walk with God? Is there anything that we can do? Make it right as we stand and sing.